Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our monthly ACE Meetup. Today's topic is profile management, and we have Michael McAlpine from the consulting services team here to do a brief introduction before we dive into the Q&A. So feel free to go ahead and start typing in your questions at any point. I do want to mention that when it comes to future state or roadmap questions that we may not be able to address here live because of legal reasons, don't forget you can always just reach out to your customer success manager. Also keep in mind that the recording will be available on demand on the ACE registration page in about a week or so. And without further ado, take it away, Michael.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Michael McAlpine with Citrix Consulting Services. I'm out of the Central Region, and we'll be delivering the second ACE Ask the Cloud Experts section on profile management and the cloud. We'll go ahead and jump into our agenda. We're going to be covering profile management basics, why as either admins or consultants we care about profiles, various profile types and options for configuration. We'll discuss Citrix profile management, which was previously called UPM. We'll discuss profile storage, some of the challenges and considerations around storage, and then we'll move into questions. So the first couple of questions we need to address are, what is a Windows profile and why do we care about profiles? Windows profiles are broken up into two pieces. There is the registry component, which is made up of ntuser.dat, and then there are the user shell folders, which include the desktop, documents, downloads, and other shell folders. Those are loaded up every time a user logs into Windows, whether they're accessing a published desktop or application. And the profile is a required part for Windows, so there's no way to just skip having a profile. In a lot of the designs that I see, profiles are often overlooked, misconfigured, or just sort of skipped over. A poorly configured profile solution can result in long login times for end users, lack of consistency, and just generally poor performance. So profiles are very important to configure correctly and highly available. We're going to move into the various types of Microsoft profiles. So our first option is a local profile, which is configured out of the box. I don't need to do anything to have a local profile. It's a default behavior in Windows, and it works fairly similarly on either a server or a workstation like Windows 7, Windows 10 OS. The benefits of a local profile are they're fast and they're consistent across that one machine. The major drawback, though, of your local profile is in the name. It's local. And so if I log into Windows 7 Desktop 1 today and Windows 7 Desktop 2 tomorrow, they're each going to have their unique Windows profile. Our second option, which sort of turns a local profile on its head, is a mandatory profile. It is a set of settings that you get when you log in. When you log out, nothing is retained from session to session. So you get that same set of default settings you got when you logged in yesterday, as you get today, as you get tomorrow. So basically what that does is it gives us a fast logon, no risk for profile corruption, and a very consistent user experience. However, I can't save settings, and all of the files that I save on that device are going to be lost after I log out. It's also going to require a unique profile for each different OS being delivered. So my Server 2012 OS will have a mandatory profile that's different from my Server 2016 operating system. Our last major profile option is a roaming profile. That's a profile shared off of a centralized storage location, either a file server or a SAN with NAS capabilities or a NAS. And when I log in, that profile is copied down. When I log out, it's copied back up. The really nice part about roaming profiles are every setting that I changed is saved and copied back up, so it's available next time I log in, along with my shell folders, including my documents, my desktop, areas users like to save files. However, there's some major drawbacks with roaming profiles. We have the issue of the last writer wins. So what happens there is if I have two server operating systems publishing different applications of the same type, they're going to use that same Windows profile. So if I make a change, like I change the background color and log out of the first session, it's going to write that back up to the file server. And if I change something else in the second session and save it, it's going to write back up, overriding what's been saved from the first session. So I lose the background color change, and that second session then overrides the profile, which is fairly problematic for use cases where you're publishing a lot of applications using the same core operating system. Another problem that we have is profile bloat, profile size, and that impacts user logons. If I have a couple gigabyte profile, no matter how fast my storage is, it's still going to take time to copy that profile down from the file server to my local client device, whether it be a published Zen desktop client or a server operating system. And the last thing, just like mandatory profiles, the profile is unique for each flavor of operating system, including the bitness of the operating system. So if I have a Windows 7 client that's 32-bit, it's going to have a different profile than a 64-bit Windows 7 client. And then I'm going to have a different profile for a Windows 10 or Windows Server client. So you can have a lot of large profiles kind of spanning your environment. To help decrease the size and to allow some flexibility for mandatory profiles, we can add in folder redirection. The same is true of roaming profiles. That cuts down on the roaming profile size quite a bit. But for mandatory profiles, we can have persistence for various items like your shell folders, which is great because if we're publishing an OS that requires the users to be able to save a shortcut to the desktop or to make a change, you can do that with a mandatory profile. However, you have some issues still that you don't run into with the roaming profile. The major one is various certificates that are normally saved to HKey current user are not retained. For roaming profiles with folder redirection, it allows us to take what would normally be the shell folders in the profile and remove those from that profile. What happens from an operating system perspective is the roaming profile is like a pointer or a symbolic link pointing us back to the file server. So what happens is we say, I want to access a file in my documents, and it says, your documents actually lives in this file server here, so access it off of there. That data is accessed on demand as opposed to being copied down every time a user logs in and then copied back up every time a user logs out. So folder redirection adds quite a bit to our Microsoft profiles and takes away some of the problems that we have with mandatory and roaming profiles. We'll now move into Citrix Profile Management. Citrix Profile Management is a tool that comes by default on all the VDA installs from 7.6 and newer. It allows us to take the Windows roaming profile, make some changes and optimizations to it to allow for faster logons with less of a risk of profile corruption. Citrix Profile Management addresses the last writer wins issue. What it does for that is it allows us to copy that first profile up and merge it with the second copy up of the profile. It allows for better control of items like app data local. We can add exclusions or whitelisting only to decrease our profile size. And we have some specialized custom settings for Citrix environments. Some of the key features for Citrix Profile Management are default inclusions and exclusions. We can allow for whitelisting and blacklisting. If we're whitelisting, that allows us to have the quickest, best logins, but it adds more complexity to setting that up. It allows for some specialized Office 365 caching search index optimization, and decrease login times when we're using Office 365. We can offload large files by creating symbolic links to those files so they're not copied every time a user logs in. We can create profile containers, and we can mount those at login, which decreases our login time because that's not part of the profile. And we also have the option to back up our nt-user.dat file and automatically revert if there's been corruption to that file. Another thing that's really nice for profile management is we can use variables in the path based on OS version and bitness, so that when we log into a 64-bit Windows 7 client, we'll have a different profile than our 32-bit Windows 7 client, and a different profile for our Server 2008 R2 or 2012 R2 or 2016 without having to set up multiple policies. So it adds a lot of flexibility. We can also use a tool to clean up data if we add an exclusion after the fact. It's a policy called login exclusion check that was added with the 7.13 release, I believe. And that's a little hidden gem that you don't get for some other profile solutions. We'll now move into profile storage considerations. One of the big things that we run into with profiles are how we're going to store them and how we want to make them highly available. Normally for on-prem environments hosted in our data centers, we'll use something like a Windows failover cluster or a storage appliance, and those can be highly available. Unfortunately, those methods aren't available in public clouds. We also want to make sure that our VDAs are as close to possible as our file server, because we don't want when a user logs in, to move that data across multiple hops. Because if you're moving a lot of profile data, that'll add extra time to the logins. Another thing that's kind of unfortunate is a lot of the Azure, AWS file server as a service solutions aren't supported because they're not mature enough in the environment. So that moves into what are our options for file servers in the cloud and our file services considerations. Our first option is a single file server. Those are the best, most easiest solutions to work with. However, they're not highly available, which creates a serious problem. If we lose that file server, we're probably going to be running at maybe 10, 15, 20% of what we should be running at when we have the file server up. So that creates an availability problem, which means most environments want to have some sort of highly available file server solution. Our next option is DFS replication plus namespace. The performance on that's fairly good. Our problem is DFS is going to replicate from your primary node to your secondary node. We shouldn't be using two primary nodes here because that replication is not immediate. And in consulting, we've seen multiple cases where user logs in and hits file server 1, makes a change to a document, and they log into a published application, and they don't see that document because it's locked and hasn't synchronized over to that second DFS target. And that will confuse end users. They'll be very upset because they'll think their work is lost, and it makes it not a very good solution as an administrator or consultant to recommend. So if we're going to use DFS replication, we should be doing one-way replication and failover. Unfortunately, that failover is manual, so this means our availability, our stability, our cost, our complexity are all suboptimal. They're not a huge risk, but having to do a manual failover is something that we want to avoid as admins. Our next option is storage spaces direct and scale out file services, or file server. The availability is great on there. However, it's a complex solution, and it adds some extra time to the login because we're writing a lot of small files. What we've seen in the field is an extra 5 to 10 seconds in the login for storage spaces direct and scale out file services. Our last option is third-party solutions. Those tend to perform pretty well. They have high availability built in. They're pretty stable, but they're costly because you have to buy something else. And some of them are fairly complex to set up and implement, and also fairly complex to manage.
All right, thank you so much for the overview on profile management, Michael. I do have one last item before moving into the Q&A, and that is to let everyone know about our new Cloud Success Center. This is a helpful one-stop shop for a wealth of cloud resources. I'm talking expert-led videos, prerequisite checklists, build guides, and so much more, so definitely be sure to check it out. And now we can move into the part you all have been waiting for. So joining Michael today on our expert panel, we have Brendan Lin, an enterprise architect, Amir Trillo, a customer success engineer, and Dylan Sparks, a lead technical engineer. So let's go ahead and dive into the questions. All right, we will start with the ones that have been pre-submitted. So thank you all for submitting. And again, go ahead and just type in any questions that you have, and we will get to them as they come in. The first question we have is, if you are using UPM, folder redirection, exclusion files, synchronizing files and folders, should you also enable profile streaming? So Amir, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I'll take it. All right. So there is no right or wrong answer for that, to be honest. You may find the profile streaming has a little difference because your profile are already very small due to folder redirection. So file exclusions or so on. So you have taken care of about all that different configurations on your profile. On my opinion, I could say that profile streaming it's the best option for a profile size.
All right, thanks, Amir. Next question we have is, with the MS, I'm assuming Microsoft, acquisition of FS Logics, what does that mean for my profile strategy? So Brendan, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure thing. This is a quickly developing topic and landscape, so we'll want to keep our eyes close to this space in the near future. For now, as announced, the FS Logic suite, which is like profile containers, Office 365 containers, application masking, etc., will be available to like all Microsoft customers who have E3 or E5 Microsoft 365 licensing, as well as if they're like a Microsoft Windows VDA customer, or even have RDS CALs. So really chances are that most customers are entitled to FS Logics. And then when it comes to Profile Manager or FS Logics, we find that there's a lot of overlap in the features. So Profile Manager is certainly fully featured and has a profile container feature as part of it, as well as part of the 1903 release. And in addition, Profile Manager is included into the Citrix VDA. So for most customers, I think that'll be the path of least resistance to offer a solid profile solution, one that's been tried and true for years and years. But FS Logic certainly has its own benefits as well. So I think we would just really recommend that customers test and go with what suits them best.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Brendan. The next one's going to be for Dylan. We have profile streaming enabled. Will profile size have an impact on user logon?
Absolutely. When profile streaming is enabled, files, folders, and items contained in the profile are fetched from the user store from the local machine, usually only when they're accessed by the users after they have logged on. So it's very similar to how buffering on like video players will work. It's the give me what I need now and I'll request the next when I need it type of mindset. However, files that exist in the pending folder and the registry entries are fetched pretty much immediately. So assuming we're using non-persistent machines in this question, which will delete their changes from the master on each subsequent reboot and thus clearing the profile, the login to the virtual delivery agent or the machine itself will re-download the profile in each login. So without the use of profile streaming, and if their profile is not configured to redirect most of its content, then the user will absolutely see an increase in login duration in comparison.
Perfect. Thank you so much. All right, so the next one we have is, should I configure profile management in Studio, Group Policy, or WEM? So I'm going to send that to you, Michael.
Okay, thank you. So the first question is, which is going to be fastest? WEM is a multi-threaded process as opposed to Citrix Profile Management from Studio or from Group Policy. So WEM is going to be a little bit faster. That being said, WEM is going to be a little bit more complicated to implement and manage, and there are going to be less people in the environment. So we're talking the general population of the US or the world that know how WEM works. More will know how CPM works in WEM through Studio, and then more people will know how Group Policy works as opposed to the other two. So from a simplicity perspective, Group Policy may be easiest, followed by Studio Policy, followed by WEM. Then there's the question of how is the environment managed. If admins that admin Citrix don't have rights to Group Policy, Studio may be easier. Thank you.
All right, perfect. The next question, what is the recommended method for preserving registration of inbox Windows 10 store apps? Example, calculators, sticky notes, etc., across logins on non-persistent VDI. Brendan, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. Windows 10 start menu layout is a pain point for many folks. There's actually a CTX article out there that I'll call out the name if you could take a look at that. It's CTX 222433. So I'll also reply back so you have that link. But essentially what this is saying and what we've guided customers to do is to make sure that there's folder mirroring for the tile data layer, which contains those that file that specifies what that start menu layout looks like. And so this applies to Windows 10 machines, and I would say start there. And then if that isn't working for you, then reach out to your Citrix rep and see if we could get a conversation to assist.
Perfect. Thanks, Brendan. Next one, we will send back to Michael. So migration of existing profiles, local and roaming. Do we need that? And if yes, what is the benefit for 7.15 CU4?
Okay. So what we could see if we have a use case where we're using a local profile or a roaming profile that's written down to the VDA, we may want to move that profile over to our profile management solution. Specifically, if we have it saved to the VDA machine, that would be a case where we may want to enable the migration of that profile into the VDA. However, in most cases, we don't do that because that can add extra complexity and can also risk more profile corruption.
Okay. So next question, what is the recommended size for a Citrix profile for optimum session initiation? So Dylan, I'm going to send you that one.
Sure. Citrix Profile Management uses the default user profile to create the initial profile. That's found on the default installation of the Windows operating system. The standard size of the default profile is about 2.5 megabytes. If you exceed this value and have a profile that's about 200 megs or 300 and increasing, you will see a hit on login, right? The standard profile size should be as small as you could possibly make it. There isn't a recommended size per se, as profiles are not really a one-size-fits-all solution unless you elect to use template profiles. profiles. However, if you keep it reasonable while also employing folder redirections and things of that nature, you'll significantly reduce your login times all around.
All right, perfect. Next question. This one's going to go to Amir. How would you handle profile size that gets larger day to day due to the browser surfing and resulting in huge caches?
Yeah. Actually, you can do it in a different way. You can specify with a GPO supplied to your infrastructure to delete these cookies. That's one of the options. Now, if you prefer to configure your profiles with Citrix Profile Management, there's a good improvement on how it processes cookies. You can enable this policy called process internet cookie files on logoff that deletes the cookies that you make during your web browsing, and it prevents to make it a large and larger profile. Now, if you find a large folders or file existing on your profiles that are not needed as part of these cookies, and that will avoid a good performance of them, you can enable also the login exclusion check. That is going to happen is that your profile is not going to synchronize to the VDA, or it is going to be deleted from itself. So you won't store any profile. You will keep it clean and as small as possible, and you can use any of these options. You can create a GPO or use the Citrix policies as well. Thank you.
Perfect. All right, so next question. We are testing Azure File Sync and DFS to sync the profile between sites and to the cloud. Do you have any experience with this solution, and do you have any recommendations? Brendan?
Yeah, so we have had some customers have utilized DFS to sync profiles between sites in the cloud. And I think a lot of it's going to depend on factors such as your express route, whether you have an express route in place or VPN, or how your network connectivity is there. I think we've had issues with Azure Files and its compatibility with NTFS and integrating with the roaming profile share. So I think that there's a little bit of concern there. But in terms of DFS for file syncing, that's certainly possible. One thing to keep in mind is that DFS should be done with consideration for which are the active targets and how you have VDAs accessing those targets. So from a Microsoft perspective, it's not supported to have like active DFS. So you don't want, because the situation you're going to hit is profile corruption. If you have a VDA like logging into against one profile share and then logging off and then hitting the other one before the files were synchronized appropriately. So just be concerned about that. I would go with probably whether it's those targets are directed, make sure that those VDAs are directed at the targets kind of like within Azure, for example, and ensure that the targets aren't moving like in an active fashion. So hope that makes sense there.
Well, thanks, Brendan. Next question is OneDrive for Business supported? Dylan.
At this time, it is not. OneDrive for Business requires access to a web browser. It's not really a profile thing. So for that reason alone, it is not. We do have a wrapper page on this technology that does actually claim that. I can see about getting that pushed out, but that is the official answer, including the OneDrive for Business basically lets users update and share files from pretty much anywhere, but based on Microsoft and the way that they set this up, the Business Sync agent itself is not supported on a terminal services-based implementation, which is directly the reason why we do not support it at this time. You will run into issues if you try and set that up.
Okay. So next one, going back to Michael, with roaming profile option, how can we improve login speed?
Yeah, so the first question is, why are my logins slow? So what I like to do if I run into a situation where logins are slow with roaming profiles is open up Director and see which portion of the login is slow. From there, you can troubleshoot. If it's a group policy issue, well, that's not a profile issue in and of itself. If it is a profile issue, then I use a tool like tree size, Winderstat, to take a look at why the profile is the size that it is. And then with a couple of test users, I remove data from the profile. So you can go and delete it, write a PowerShell script to delete it. Either of those work. Have the user log in, see if they lose any settings or any experience is different. And then if we've decided that we can remove that data from the profile, we'll then create an exclusion for that and use the logon inclusion check to see if we want to, logon exclusion check to see if we want to delete or ignore that data as part of the profile. But it's really just troubleshooting and taking advantage of the tools that you have at your disposal.
All right, perfect. So next question, are there plans to expand the profile container functionality to store the full profile? I'm going to let Brendan answer that if he can without, stepping on any NDA toes.
Yeah, and at this time, I don't believe that is the case. With the profile container functionality that, again, that was released in the 1903 release, which just came out a couple months ago, that allows you to specify a folder with a bunch of large files, for example, something like Java cache, for example, and then it'll be redirected as a VHDX. So that's how it is today. Can't speak necessarily to the future, but that's profile containers as it is today.
All right. Next up, what is the difference between folders to synchronize and folders to mirror UPM policy? How do they differ in terms of operations, i.e. download and upload from network share, etc.? So I'm going to let Dylan handle that one.
So the way that I like to explain it to people is that profile sync versus profile mirroring, or folders to mirror, folders to synchronize, is that synchronize is more or less just a copy paste with no logic included, right? But the mirror brings over the logic of the files itself. So let's use the cookies folder of Internet Explorer as a primary example, right? Because there's that DB file or an index.dat file that has a job of querying and indexing certain aspects that belong in that folder, that logic cannot just be copy and pasted. It has to be dropped in a specific order, and for that reason, it has to be mirrored. Mirrors will require a lot more time to make sure that they are dropped into the profile properly than just a copy paste sync, right? So things that you would sync would be something like your bookmarks or stuff like that for a browser, because that's just an icon or some sort of link file. It's nothing really intense, but the index.dat, or if you have DB files or EDB files and things like that that have to load in a specific order, specific Java operations, as well as some other stuff, would definitely need to be mirrored and not synced in that kind of equation. So just think of it as mirror brings over the logic of a DB file, EDB files, and things of that nature, stuff that a simple copy paste of the directory itself would not solve.
Okay. So next question, active write-back seems to be causing issues and inconsistency when enabled in SBC Server OS VDA scenarios. Ooh, mouthful. Is this recommended by Citrix or not? In which scenarios is active write-back recommended? Michael?
Yeah, so a couple notes about active write-back. First off, it adds extra load to your file server. What active write-back is doing is, if you've got two sessions that are connected using the same profile, when you log out of the first session, it's going to write that profile back up. However, the second time you log out, it will write back and override some of the data written out from the first profile. What active write-back does is it allows you to merge those two into a single profile so that you don't lose settings from that first session that logged out. Citrix doesn't have a recommendation as to use or not use active write back. It's really whether you think you're in a scenario where you could run into that. So say, for example, I have a desktop that I publish and it's used for 99% of what my users are doing, but we've got maybe one or two other applications that are being published out of a silo that's using the same OS version. So it's going to use the same profile. If we need something to be retained, if a user logs out of that siloed published application, we may want to have active write back enabled. If we publish out of a different OS, so say our published desktop in this case is Windows 10 or Server 2016, and we're publishing a legacy application out of Server 2008 R2, we're not going to benefit from active write back in this case. So I would just disable it in that scenario. But it's really dependent on what you're doing in that scenario.
Okay, perfect. So next question we're going to send back to Dylan. What is the recommendation on migrating UPM profiles when moving from Windows 10 version to version ? For example, from 1709 to 1809.
So specifically with those two versions, Microsoft changed quite a lot with specific to the Start menu. The Start menu has been, as it was mentioned earlier, a pain point for all roaming profile solutions, including Microsoft's as well, due to the decision they've made with the tiled data layer. So in 1709, the Start menu was originally derived of a folder called the tiled data layer, which now is known as the Cloud Store and has changed. Those versions mean the difference, right? So when Microsoft updates that technology, it's seen in subsequent versions of the profile. So when you're migrating, you want to make sure that your path to profile store is separating those versions. There is a specific command or a specific path to profile that you want to make sure is in there so that your subsequent logons are specific directly to the version of Windows that you're logging into. Again, we truly believe that redirecting everything that you possibly can is the best solution to move forward with this. So if the documents, pictures, and everything that a user or boss or anything that really is using the profile solution would care about are in those folders, then realistically changing and updating your path to profile store to reflect the OS version, which I'm trying to find the exact path that is, and I can send that to you directly. But you want to make sure that that's in place so that subsequent versions of Windows that are used, whether it's 2019 when that gets full support, or even the different versions of 2016 are dropping in different profile sets, so that if you are using an older profile for 1709 and you're slowly phasing that to the 1809 or 1803 or whatever 1903 version, doesn't matter, that you are still phasing those properly and that they have different profiles. And then when you've successfully eliminated the prior versions of Windows, you can go into each of the profiles and then remove the older profile from existence if you so wanted to.
All right, perfect. Thank you. So next question is coming your way, Brendan. If you use Azure Active Directory services, what is the recommendation if you want to use something like a DFS?
Yeah, that might be tough. It's probably going to be a short answer, but as far as I know, DFS replication requires access to physical or virtualized domain controllers. It doesn't communicate directly with Azure AD or Azure AD domain services. So, I mean, I could be wrong here, but I believe that a full Active Directory is required for DFS.
All right, well, got away easy on that one. We'll come back to you in a second. So next one for Michael. If users are using MS OneDrive on their Office clients, what profile management solution should be used on Citrix side?
Yeah, so unfortunately, OneDrive isn't supported for terminal services. So there really isn't a good answer for a profile solution that does support it. If you're going to use a profile solution, again, it doesn't really matter. The recommendation for OneDrive is to use the web as opposed to using a client version. That'll allow users to access the files without trying to synchronize anything down or up, which is very problematic for users logging in.
All right. The next one, coming back to you, Dylan, what are some of the best diagnostic tools available as far as profiles are concerned?
So we're going to mirror Microsoft's answer on this. The Citrix answer that I can give you for the profile is that we store a log in System 32 unless you're specifying otherwise via policy. That log is plain text and quite easy to read. If you Control F or find the username that you're trying to follow, you could see the times in minutes and seconds on how long it's taking to work. The other answer that I'm going to give you that mirrors Microsoft is that Procmon is also fantastic. You could use perfmon to identify the loading order and sequential order of the operating system. But honestly, anything that gives you more insight. So if you're troubleshooting a login issue or a timing issue, then if you're not sure on where to go or if it's the size of the profile that's having the issue, the UPM logs that are located in the System 32 User Profile Manager directory or Citrix Profile Manager, I don't recall what the exact name is, but it's under System 32 on the VDA machine directly. You will see the log file there. You can also change that path as well as what that log will contain through policy that's available on Studio, or if you're importing those into AD, they'll be available there, and you can change those to reflect what you want. Otherwise, Procmon is a fantastic tool if you've narrowed it down to sizing. I believe it was mentioned on this call that tree size or just looking at the size of the profile to see what exactly is taking up that space could also be used. These profiles will emulate how Microsoft does these profiles as well. So what can be used to troubleshoot a Microsoft profile, with the exception of the specific Citrix logs, can be used on the UPM ones.
Yeah, another tool that I found pretty useful is the UPM config check. If you do a Google for that, it's a PowerShell script on the Citrix support page. And it just examines what the existing configurations are in a profile manager environment. And I guess the area I've seen most value out of this is because sometimes you could configure profile management in so many locations, and sometimes there's conflicting GPOs as well. So you could see actually what the effective policy setting is to help troubleshoot what your profile path is, et cetera, all the settings.
Yeah, another thing to add to that too is make sure we're only configuring profile management in one place. Don't do part in group policy, part in WEM, and part in Studio. That makes troubleshooting very complicated. From the log path perspective, it's C Windows System 32 log files and then User Profile Manager.
All right, perfect. So next question we're going to send over to Amir. Do you recommend enabling the disable automatic configuration policy or not?
Well, it depends on your environment. You want to configure your profile the better option for your infrastructure. So I would say disable it, because at the end of the day, you want to specify any folder redirection, any specific configuration that you want for the look and feel of your users. So recall that you're going to be in charge of a profiles administration. So you don't want to get any difficulty or any issue when you're trying to upload your profiles, or say, okay, I want to handle any type of issue and I don't know where to start. So you have to be perfectly define how your profiles are going to be configured, where are going to be located, the size, the exclusions, and all the things that represent the health of a profile. So I wouldn't say as a best practice, but a good option is to do not enable it.
All right. So next question for Michael. If I'm using a file server and want to move profile location to another system like a NAS, what would be the quickest/easiest and non-impact way of migrating the profile?
Sure. So this is really an environmental question. What I would do is pick the time that you know you have the least amount of users logged on. A maintenance window is a good example. What you're going to want to do is use a tool like Robocopy a couple weeks in advance to move as much data as possible. Have it run just during a normal time but a time where you don't have a ton of user load. So something like in the evening, have it copy over initially, everything can get over. Run the tool again about a week in advance, again, during a time where there isn't a ton of user load. Something like a maintenance window is good for this one too, so that copies over as much as possible. I would run it once more. Depending on the time that it takes to run, if you can get it done during that maintenance window that you're going to cut the profile solution over in, that would be where I would run it, just to make sure users aren't connected. You may have already rebooted the VDAs too to clear off user sessions, and that way you get any last things that were either locked or unable to copy, and you've got clean copies. Once you're at that point, flip your path to user store over to the new location, log in as yourself, a test user to make sure it works, and then once you're done, you're basically done and good to go. I've also done similar cutovers with DFS where you start replicating that way. I just don't trust that DFS is going to do a good enough job to really guarantee that you're going to get everything there. So I like to use Robocopy because I've run into issues with DFS in the past where with profile data, it just doesn't work as you expect it to work.
Perfect. All right, next one for Dylan. Any recommended tools for measuring logon times and especially troubleshoot profile corruption, example, locked files?
So this one's going to boil down to, you could use Procmon, set up a filter for file locked and identify locked files of that nature. As far as profile is doing from a driver stance, so Citrix UPM utilizes that JIT driver will output into the log file located into the system32 log files directory that was mentioned previously. Reading that is very simple. It is plain text. There are no independent symbol files that you need to know. You can follow that down to see what it's doing. But as far as anything that's locked, it's the operating system that identifies it's locked and reports back to the driver that it couldn't do what it needed to do. So looking in the UPM log, the log for locks is not necessarily the best idea. You will see an access denied or a 0xC05 or something of that nature that says access and inaccessible from the UPM log, but realistically the Procmon will be the best place to look for the file locked or any sort of corruptions on the profile when it's trying to log in. The UPM data that comes from the JIT driver in the UPM logs might be helpful, but it's not going to be the lead data that support, such as myself here at Citrix, would request. It would be a Procmon, at least in my opinion.
All right, perfect. So next question for Michael. Regarding the delete locally cached profiles on logoff policy, in which scenarios is it required and when is it not?
Okay, so in a scenario where I'm using a roaming profile, I would definitely want to delete the locally cached profile. As the profile is copying up, you may have data that doesn't get copied, or there's a file that's locked, or there's, maybe in the past a user is logged into that server, say it's an admin, via RDP or another method that's going to cache some profile data to that server. When I'm roaming my profile, I don't want any persistency from session to session that's saved to that local device. So that's when I would enable it.
All right, coming back to Dylan, what are the Citrix recommended tools for CPM troubleshooting and tracing? UPM troubleshooter or other tools?
I believe that we've already covered this, but it'll be the tools I mentioned before. You could use the UPM check, you could use Procmon, you could use Perfmon if you really wanted to get into the nitty gritty. The UPM logs themselves can be selected to include registry interactions, file system interactions, so on and so forth from policy. Procmon is always my go-to because you get to see what the Windows operating system is doing. The way that the Citrix profile loads is that it'll be called by WinLogon and happen during that phase. So Procmon will be able to be sorted in a specific way that you can see each interaction and where the most amount of time is occurring. So that's going to be what you really want to gather, at least from a technical standpoint, if the UPM logs cannot answer your initial suspicions or questions.
Perfect. All right, coming back to Brendan. Is profile container available for 7.15 CU4? I don't see this particular setting from a GPO profile management.
Yeah, this one actually, I think I mentioned it briefly before, but this was released in the 1903, so it's not part of LTSR as it is today. So you'll have to go to 1903 for the profile containers.
All right, so coming back to Michael, is it better to have profiles on a separate file server instead of storing them on the DDC regarding performance of profile loading and all other DDC services?
So if you're using a very small environment, you probably won't notice a performance difference. However, once you start to hit scale, you will definitely notice a performance issue with logins if your delivery controller is fairly hot. So you're using a lot of CPU and memory, or the file services delivered from that delivery controller is using a lot of CPU and memory or disk I/O. Me personally, I split everything out. I don't like to have infrastructure that does one thing also containing an infrastructure service that does something else. Even in my home lab, I like to split that out because I want to be able to turn a delivery controller on or off without impacting profiles. It also allows you to do maintenance easier if you do hit a case where something happens and you need to take one of the delivery controllers offline. In a large environment, don't coexist infrastructure that shouldn't be together on a single server. So don't install your delivery controller with your storefront, for example. Split that out into 2 servers. In a lab environment, it really doesn't matter, but I like to mirror production as close to possible with my labs. So I always install file server services on a different server than my delivery controller.
All right, so next step for Dylan, what would be considered an acceptable login time out in the field?
So on the support side of Citrix, we tend to troubleshoot profiles that exceed about a minute. Again, sizing will vary how long it takes, as well as policy configuration. If you're using template profiles, then of course your time should be matched, assuming that the bandwidth to download everything is adequate. Or if you're setting XML settings for it, then it'll all be group policy delivery timers through the notifier of GP client. Outside of that, if you are in the field and your network is 100% stable with good latency, good bandwidth, good everything, then realistically you should see login times that are below 1 minute in total. Now, if your profile size is very large, where you're including an OST file that's 20 gigs, 30 gigs, mileage may vary, right? And I mean that quite literally, in the sense of it just depends on so many variables that there's not a simple answer to that question. The smaller the profile, the better your solution will be. That's why we always push for redirections and redirect as much as you can outside of the initial profile.
All right, perfect. Next step for Brendan. What is the purpose of the CPM cross-platform settings policies?
Yeah, that one's an interesting one, and to be honest, not one that I commonly see out in the field being used. But the primary use case for cross-platform settings is to assist with the migration between different OS platforms. So think of like if you have a Win 7 VDI today and you're looking to move to Win 10, and you want to move users over there, but you don't want them to lose their Office settings in the meantime. So from the profile management perspective, we would recommend to have a separate profile, and that because you have a different OS type, different profile version, etc. But that also means that the application settings don't follow along with it. So with cross-platform settings, you could specify like a particular application and the associated registry, and then have those synchronized between the multiple profiles as part of your migration effort.
All right. So I know we're running short on time. We'll try to answer as many more questions as we can, but keep in mind I will be sending a follow-up blog to depending on, give me at least a week or so, and we'll try to answer any of the remaining questions, or we'll just reach out to you directly. So we have a lot coming in, which is really great, and I'm excited that you guys all have questions and hope everyone's benefiting from it, but we will be able to answer them, if not today, then in the blog. So next up, for Dylan, what is the difference between folder synchronization and folder mirroring in CPM?
So this was answered earlier. Think of folder synchronization to be more of a literal copy-paste of the directory itself, whereas mirroring would be the working mechanics of the file. So EDB files, DB files, you typically do not want to put your synchronizations into your mirroring, as mirroring does do additional checks that synchronizations do not. So in very large environments, I have seen around 10 items in the mirroring section. And again, each one will vary on customer to customer, but most of the workhorse will be in the synchronized directories. So you want to keep as few items in the mirror as possible because that will prolong your login experience. And it should only be as needed, not a just in case policy setting that you set.
All right, so next up for Michael, what are the minimum IOPS requirements for latest CPM versions in LTSR and CR releases?
Minimum IOPS requirements. So we don't have minimum IOPS requirements. Usually IOPS is, the required IOPS is based on what a user is doing. So a regular task worker may be consuming 10 IOPS on a manually provisioned ZDA per user. If we're using MCS or PBS and taking advantage of the RAM cache, that'll be cut down to half an IOP, 1 IOP, something along that amount of IOPS. And the IOP requirements are also dependent on the version of the server you're using too. So for a general task user, I would target about 10 to 15 per user, going up from there. And it's good to have it's good to have more IOPS and less IOPS on a server too. So purchasing faster storage, outside of hurting your pocketbook when you buy the storage, it's not going to hurt you from a performance perspective as opposed to using older spinning disk technology. And then with profiles, also remember, the faster the storage, the faster your load time is going to be. So fast storage is essential for profiles.
All right, and we'll try to fit in a couple more. Next one to Brendan. What are the main reasons why a temporary profile is created at Citrix user logon?
Yeah, there's a variety of reasons why a temp profile would be created, but I think that one of the largest causes is because there's some kind of profile lock, like if the profile wasn't logged out correctly, perhaps that could result in a temporary profile. Or I guess another common one would be if there's an issue with the profile path, such that Profile Manager isn't able to write to that profile share. So as a result, it needs to revert back to a temporary profile. So I would say in those scenarios, definitely check out the event logs, the application log. There's usually reasons as to why. And then also some of the other troubleshooting tools as mentioned in this call, particularly the UPM log file would probably be the best source of information.
All right, perfect. And hopefully we can fit in at least one more. To Dylan, any suggestions for using Procmon or on VMs that are non-persistent, and any blogs on the configuration of Procmod for troubleshooting? And I apologize if I just completely butchered that question.
That's okay. I understand what he means. With regards to Procmon, the same Okay, so if you've never used Procmon before, what it does is it identifies the executables that are running on the machine. Then it identifies the PID, the operation of what it's trying to do, the result of said operation, and further details from there, including the path, right? If you see the Citrix profile manager.exe or any of that other stuff that's in there, you could apply filters. You could even open up tools or use Control T to open up the process tree, which is what I use to identify which part of the profile is going wrong. So is there a blog on this? Nothing Citrix specific because it's not a Citrix specific tool. We just use it to identify what our executables are doing or what the operating system is doing. My advice to you, because it sounds like you're actively troubleshooting something or would like to know how to troubleshoot something, if you're encountering an issue with one of your profiles or your profile solution, open a case up with our teams here at the Citrix support team staff and kind of see where it's going wrong with our help, and then we can kind of educate you a little bit better on the nitty gritty than briefly touching on it on this call.
All right, so we are just out of time. I know there's a couple questions we haven't gotten answers to, so we'll reach out to you directly or just keep an eye out for that blog. But yeah, we'll have a blog write-up of the Q&A, so keep an eye out for that, and then we'll also post the on-demand video so you can go back and listen to the questions again. And be sure to register for our next meetup. It's going to be on Wednesday, June 19th, and the topic will be networking. Thank you guys so much, and special thanks to all of the presenters. I appreciate you guys, your time, all the experts, and I hope everyone has a great rest of your week. Thank you so much.
Thank you.